Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited to have you here today to our final week of the Migration Summit. I have a very special guest today. Oh my goodness, sorry, I'm trying to get everything organized. There we are. Very special session today about a topic that's really quite, I don't know, special to me. I think special to all of us working in this space. Evaluations. My name is Lorraine Charles. I'm the Executive Director of NAML and one of the co-chairs of this summit. The MIT Migration Summit 2022, organized by MIT Refugee Action Hub, NAML, Karam Foundation, Paper Airplanes, and the MIT Abdul Latif Jameel World Education Labs, J-WEL, is a month-long global convening designed to build bridges between diverse communities of displaced learners, universities, companies, non-profits, NGOs, social enterprises, foundations, philanthropists, researchers, policymakers, employers, and governments around the key challenges and opportunities for refugee and migrant communities. This year, we're exploring the theme of educational workforce development and displacement through virtual events hosted by participating partners around the world. So this panel, how do we know what works? We know that evaluations are meant to help us determine what works well and under what conditions and what could be improved. But with refugee education and livelihood programs, how do we know we're measuring the right thing? We have heard throughout this summit about the importance of quality education and livelihood programs for refugees. To what extent is the quality of education or training provided taken into account when we evaluate refugee interventions? The panel seeks to explore, via experiences from the field, how refugee communities are being measured. I have the pleasure to introduce my moderator today, Dr. Claudia Urrea from MIT J-WEL. Claudia, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, and welcome everyone. And my name is Claudia Urrea. I work at MIT under the Jameel World Education Lab, and I coordinate K-12 activities, through the lab, but also by collaborating with many groups at MIT. I'm super excited about this panel and being among a group of experts to facilitate this conversation about evidence and what matters. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists today. I'm going to say something very short about each of them and invite them to talk more about their role in their organization. So I'm going to begin with Christina Peebles. She's the Managing Director of Paper Airplanes and currently pursuing a second Master's in Education Planning, Economics, and International Development at UCL. Her research focuses on incentives for increasing education attainment among children prone to labor engagement. Christina, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for giving me the chance to speak today. Thank you to Lorraine, especially for the invite. I'm excited to be here. And yes, so I'm the Managing Director of Paper Airplanes. And these days we have two programs, English and Women in Tech. And we offer both of those to conflict-affected individuals around the world, refugees, displaced, and also some host country nationals. So we serve around 1,000 to 1,500 students per year.
Thank you so much, Christina. And Paper Airplanes was funded very recently. Do you want to say a couple of things about that, just for reference?
Well, we've been around for a while, but we recently did go through a major change in the organization structure. But we were first founded in 2014, so I guess going on 8 years now. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Christina. I'm going to follow with Joanna Hofman. She's the Associate Director of RAND Europe, an evaluator with over 20 years of experience. Joanna works primarily on employment and social policy issues, and her research interests include gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. Joanna?
Thank you very much, Claudia and Lorraine. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm really super excited because evaluation is something that I really live and breathe. and I'm very passionate about. So that's it's a really perfect opportunity for me to discuss it with others. Indeed, I have quite a background in evaluation. My research focus, as you rightly point out, focuses on labor markets, employment, but also social policy, and includes gender diversity and inclusion issues. At the moment, I actually work on a study that looks at skills and training pathways for disadvantaged groups that help them into green jobs. And as mentioned, I work for RAND Europe, which is a not-for-profit research organization. And we primarily do policy research and analysis, and we're very proud of being objective and not aligned with any political parties. And this is something that we very much adhere to. At the same time, all our work we're trying to put in a public domain and make available for everyone, to different audiences as well, and really make a difference to people's life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And it's wonderful to have you here with this background and experience. And thank you for the contributions you're making to this body of evidence-based work. I'm going to continue with Emma. Emma Smith is a PhD candidate in public policy at Harvard University, where she studies development and behavioral economics. In her research, she uses randomized controlled trials, RCTs, to study the efficacy of humanitarian interventions for forcibly displaced populations. Emma, welcome.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure and an honor as well to be here today, speaking alongside such accomplished co-panelists. As Claudia was saying, I'm doing my PhD in public policy, and in my research, I mostly focus on how we can use randomized control trials to understand how effective different programs are. And I've had the, I think, really great learning experience to bring that methodology to humanitarian programming, which is probably perhaps one of the hardest, I think, areas to really try to apply this particular methodology. So I'm just looking forward to talking more about that today. And in particular, I'll reference some of the work that I'm doing with Syrian refugees in Jordan, where I've had the great opportunity to collaborate with a couple of different humanitarian organizations there, the Norwegian Refugee Council and the IRC being the main two. But I'll look forward to talking about that more.
Thank you so much, Emma. And yeah, again, wonderful to have you. Finally, we have Ned. As a senior program officer, Ned supports the implementation of refugee point programming in the field and has a wealth programming development and implementation expertise. Ned is also a focal point for Refugee Point for partner support over the 30 agencies currently applying the Selfreliance index that Ned is going to talk to us about. Again, Ned has joined Refugee Point since 2019. Ned Meerdink, welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Yep, as was just mentioned, I work primarily on a measurement tool that's called the Selfreliance Index. Falls under the umbrella of a multi-stakeholder coalition of agencies that are working to promote refugee, the displaced person self-reliance in field level programming. So yeah, happy to contribute to the panel today. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Okay, after introductions, we're going to go into questions. We have, as Lorraine introduced, some main questions that we have for all of our panelists, and in particular highlighting their area of expertise. So I'm going to go to the chat. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat. So I'm going to begin with a question maybe a couple of the panelists can address. How are education and livelihood programs being measured? To what extent the measurements are meaningful, what they tell us, and basically, are we measuring the right things when it comes to education and livelihood programs for the population we're trying to benefit? So I welcome any of the panelists to answer that question. I'm going to pick on either John or Nett, since you have the widest experience. I think, yeah.
I'm happy to start.
Yes.
It's always difficult to start. I think what the example that I wanted to give, and it also kind of comes back to the work that we're doing, is partially answering your question about how to measure the education and livelihood programs. The example I wanted to give comes from the work of my colleagues, Shelley Coverson and Tom Link, who have conducted an evaluation of the emergency education response for Syrian refugee children and host communities in Jordan. That was carried out a couple of years ago, but it really nicely fits in the topics today and really answers the question to some extent how the education programs can be evaluated. That was, of course, a very specific case because it was an emergency program, and the methodology that has been used eventually was a mixed method evaluation. And we use the OECD DAC evaluation criteria, which look specifically at the relevance of the intervention, the effectiveness of the intervention, to what extent it's been efficient and sustainable. And interestingly enough, I think two main aspects of the education program was considered. The first was the access to education, and the second was the quality of the education. And I say interestingly because the quality of the education was a secondary outcome. The first primary outcome of concern was really whether there is access to education for the refugee children. And I think the focus on the children's rights and children's participation was particularly clear in this evaluation. This is primarily because of the methods that were chosen. So we relied, of course, on the documentation review, on interviews with the stakeholders, with focus groups, with students and teachers and relevant stakeholders in the agencies. But the one particular method that really shines through evaluation is the participatory photography that brings the emergency education program to life, and it really empowers the participants. It puts the refugee children in the focus and in power of capturing what education means to them, capturing it through photography, enabling them to create captions and share their experiences and their observations through discussions with others. And that was something quite unique and quite a powerful tool for evaluation to really bring the education program to life, highlight some of the areas for improvement and for further action. I'm not sure to what extent it would be interesting for participants to hear about the results of the evaluation. Maybe I'll just highlight very, very briefly of what we found and just focus on key aspects of that in terms especially of the access and quality of the education. So at the time when the evaluation was carried out, what we found is that the first response to the emergency crisis was considered relevant, but as the crisis unfolded and went on, there was a long-term strategy that was clearly lacking in response to address the educational needs, both of the refugee children, but also of the host communities in Jordan. And in terms of the access, even though an impressive number of children were provided with the access to education, it was over 130,000 children at that time when the evaluation was conducted. There were still about 97,000 that struggled with access to education. So the answer to to what extent the response was relevant is that there was still area for improvement. And the same went about the quality of the education, with the overcrowded classes, with the missing support for the teachers, with behaviors at class and schools that were not necessarily very well addressed at the time because of the lack of the resources. So these were the kind of highlighted findings that I did want to bring to the discussion. But coming back to your question, the methodology or how the evaluation was carried out was dictated by pragmatic considerations, and it was in response to some developments that have been in place and needed to kind of keep in pace with the developments on the ground. So I'll be really keen to hear thoughts from colleagues on the panel and also from the audience, because of course, in such situations when there is a rapid response that is needed, it's very difficult to really design or implement sometimes impact robust evaluations like randomized controlled trials. I'm sure it's possible, and I would be really, really keen to hear how this is done, but also the practical implications, because for the results of randomized controlled trials in education in particular, you probably need to wait quite a long time, while the kind of much more pragmatic evaluation or evaluation that incorporates both process aspects, implementation aspects, might also be very, very needed to provide suggestions for improvements on the ground that can be done, relatively quickly and helpfully. I'll pause here because I'm sure that there will be others.
Yes, thank you so much, Joanna. I think you brought up pretty interesting points. One in the sort of innovative method that you mentioned, and also in the particular population, and I feel like there's a need for the evaluation to be integrated with the implementation to make sure that it's aligned. We'll address some of those things in other questions. I'm going to go to Ned and ask about the index that he has been working on with 30 different agencies. So the Selfreliance index, and ask about that work and why an index is important. Ned, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much. In a nutshell, the Selfreliance Index is a scored survey tool that gets high-level information on 12 different domains, we call them, but really they're just topics of a displaced family's life that we need to know about to make an assessment on how self-reliant a household is. Basically, I think one of the kind of distinguishing factors of the index is that it's a relatively holistic tool. So if you think about the concept of self-reliance and what it actually means to be self-reliant, we know that making a measurement of that can't necessarily be rooted to a specific sector. So that's not really how households work anywhere. And so the tool is quite broad. So we don't focus it on a single sector. We don't focus it on a single area of response, but we're asking questions about education. We're asking questions about health. We're asking questions about food consumption and shelter. And what we tried to do is make it a relatively quick to apply assessment. And so over a 2-year kind of development process, we basically were able to boil it down to 12 areas that we wanted to explore, and it's only 14 questions. And it's a scored survey tool. So those questions relate to kind of 3 broader questions that we're trying to understand about households when we're assessing the level of self-reliance of the household. And the first question is, are just basic needs being met? And to which degree are those basic needs being met? And so from there, once we establish that, and that occurs over the first 3 or 4 questions of the assessment, then we move to a line of questioning that relates more to how are those basic needs being met. So are they being met by employment? Are they being met by assistance? Are they being met by borrowing money? Are they being met by all of these different factors? And I think a lot of you that have worked with a lot of displaced communities would know that usually it's a really diverse basket of things that contribute to how families are actually going about meeting their basic needs. So once we establish the means of meeting the basic needs, then we make an assessment on, okay, how sustainable are those means of meeting the basic needs? And so we ask about, is the local security environment conducive for going out and doing things which we know are positive for self-reliance, like pursuing employment or getting your kids out to school, this sort of thing. And so when we combine that all together, what we emerge with at the end of the tool is a score for a household. So a comprehensive score between 1 and 5, 1 being really low level self-reliant, 5 being basically self-reliant. And then we also get that same 1 to 5 score for every single domain or topic that we talk about. So this is really important for practitioners because, as you all know, many of you who have been involved in field level response, that's my background. I did that for about 15 years before I came to Refuge Point. Field teams actually, they want this comprehensive view of the household so that they can cater services to the actual, to the dynamic and changing needs of households and changing capacities of households. But they also want to be able to zero in on the sectors or the areas of response which they engage with most directly. So if there are gaps in those sectors which agencies are engaging in, then they can begin to address those. So in many ways, the tool is not just a way of kind of getting a readout on a household self-reliance, but it's also a way to identify gaps in the response that could be addressed to more proactively promote households on this journey towards self-reliance. And, I think the importance of it, I think, there are so many reasons that it's important to refer to the question of, do our services, do the things that we put in place in humanitarian response have a net positive impact on self-reliance? A couple that come to mind, one of the things that we experience, like I said, Refuge Point is the co-chair of the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, which is really a big group of all sorts of different actors, but it includes government actors and donors. And one of the things that we hear a lot from those stakeholders is an increasing desire and importance on their side of understanding that the funds that we put in place, do these have a positive impact on refugee self-reliance? Are we continuing dependence, or are we addressing this question of self-reliance and actually trying to put services in place that help people stand on their own 2 feet more and more? And I mean, the reason behind why that's important, I mean, I think for many of you would be obvious, but there are never sufficient funds to do the job that we want to do. You can see the global appeals, they're relatively underfunded every single year. I can't remember a single operation that I ever worked in where they said, "Oh, we actually have too much funds, so we don't have to target them as well." So I think with that in mind, we know that there will be needs that are unmet. So if there are ways to promote people to meet some of those needs on their own and to stand on their own 2 feet, I think that that's really important. And I think the most important reason, and the reason that the initiative decided to develop the Self-Reliance Index is actually, this is what refugees and displaced people want. So when we speak and work with those communities, what they're saying is, hey, we would like to not have to depend on you guys to come around with irregular assistance, 12-month program cycles, we appreciate that help. It helps us get on our feet, but what we really want to do is stand on our own feet. So I think that that's probably the most important reason why we should be considering the question of self-reliance, and why we should be within operations trying to measure our impact on that. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, this is great, Nick. I think this is so important. I love the word holistic, just because it's not just one dimension. I use the word dimension when you talk about those 12, because just addressing one is not going to, make things self-sustaining and build that self-reliance for the families. I was going to ask, who uses it? And I love that you mentioned that families really use it to understand how, the programs they have access to, or, the programs that come to serve them really can speak for something that they can hold. So this is wonderful. And thank you. I think Lorraine shared the link for the work, the Self-Reliance Initiative, and I love the title because it speaks for what it's trying to create. So thank you so much. I'm going to move to Emma and invite Emma to talk about her work with random control trials in the context of refugee programs, and tell us about her work in Jordan. Emma, welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think that Ned actually set me up great with the conversation around limited funds and trying to think of how we can really think about impact when trying to decide how to allocate funds across programs. And I think that that's like really sort of been the inspiration behind RCTs, at least that's my perspective, I think. And so just, I'm sure a lot of people in the room are very familiar with RCTs, but just to give a little bit of a background, the idea of an RCT or a randomized control trial is that when you have a program that has already had quite a bit of, let's say, the process evaluation, I think Joanna was talking about, of figuring out, okay, how do we want to implement this? What do we think is like a good design for implementing a program? And now we really want to understand if this program is implemented, hopefully in as close to its ideal form as possible, or at least a realistic form, what is that impact going to be? Then you might try to use a randomized control trial methodology where you have quite a large sample of individuals, usually several hundred or thousands even, and you're actually going to randomize which people are going to get the program and which are not. So inherently, there's going to be some people who aren't getting the program. Sometimes that's just a delay. So we say these people are going to get it first, these other people will get it later. Or other times you say, we only, and this has been the case for one of the projects I worked on, for example, you say, we only have enough funding to provide this service to say 2,000 households. However, perhaps we run a vulnerability assessment or a screening and we find 10,000 households that would be eligible for this. So what we can do, and this is actually exactly what we did in an evaluation with the Norwegian Refugee Council in Jordan, which was a large housing subsidy program. Where they provided about 12 months of full rental assistance to Syrian refugee households living in Jordan, along with some physical improvements to their homes. And so what we did was we started out with a really large sample of individuals being screened in. And then of that sort of distribution of people, we first took the people who were the most vulnerable using an assessment act, kind of similar to the one that Ned was describing, but a different one, but a vulnerability assessment, and screened out the people who were the most vulnerable and said, okay, those people are guaranteed the program. Then we screened out the people who, at least according to this assessment and keeping in mind the limited funds, were viewed as the least vulnerable and screened them out. And then we were still left with several thousand people, of which we couldn't serve all of them. And so we randomized who got that program. And so by doing this, what we were able to do is then come back later. So we did a 1-year follow-up and then now like a 1.5 or 2-year follow-up, and do really intensive surveys with these households to understand many dimensions of their lives and how they were impacted by getting this assistance. So on one hand, we have sort of the process, which really the Norwegian Refugee Council tracked of, did these households end up getting the assistance once they were assigned to get it? But then we have sort of the more longer term impact side, which was where our RCT came in. And it was interesting because we actually, we had a lot of hypotheses of what we might expect to find. And although, the analysis is still pretty preliminary, so I don't want to say too much, but we have already found some surprising results. So on one hand, we have not found much evidence of significant labor market impacts, but we have actually found positive impacts on child schooling, that children of treated households seem perhaps more likely to be going to school. So, we're finding these mixed results. And to me, this is really one of the most valuable aspects of an RCT, is that although it's quite difficult to do, and, and I'm happy to talk more about, sort of the logistics of how one might go about this. But, I think sometimes when we look at evidence, we might find these mixed results and we wonder, is what we're finding just an anomaly, or is this something that we should really take seriously and guide future decisions and guide future, programming? And something that's really wonderful about an RCT is that, well, you can never say, this is going to apply to every context, to every implementation. You can really look at that evidence and take it pretty seriously. And I think that's quite powerful for then, guiding future programming decisions. So that's kind of my pitch on these. And like I said, I'm very happy to talk more about the logistics and how one goes about doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I'm going to save a question of do no harm for later, and we can invite others to also pitch in. But I feel like one of the things that I'm always thinking about when thinking about RCTs is a well-done RCT, like you said, looks under what conditions things work, and really informs policy in other places. I have many questions about is it necessary to continue to do RCTs when we know something works and we want to scale programs to different populations? So let's first invite Christina to talk about her work, an evaluation that she's been doing on women in tech, and the findings. This is a long-term impact, so Christina, please share with us the work that you have been doing with paper airplanes.
Thank you. I think I can share my screen.
Yes,
See
you
if it
should.
says it's been disabled. I might need to retry that.
I think you just became a co-host,
There.
so you can share.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Great. So I have
We can
just
see your screen.
awesome. Okay. So I have just 9 short slides. And so basically, like Claudia was saying, we did a long-term impact evaluation. And by doing this, we really are making the case for evaluating long-term impact, because so often organizations stop at the 6-month mark and rarely do evaluations beyond that. And in the second path, we also looked at evaluating decent work. Not only is the beneficiary employed, but do they have fair working conditions? So, we were interested mainly in those 2 questions. And we had a few different pieces to this evaluation. The first, of course, a desk review. And I was curious to see similar NGOs like Paper Airplanes. How are they measuring and when are they measuring workforce-related outcomes? And then we sent a survey to our program graduates for academic and workforce outcomes. And finally, we're doing some focus groups with our graduates. I'm just keeping it very brief here for the sake of time. So for the desk review, we looked at what's being measured by other like-minded organizations. And most often, we found that they're looking at simply whether the beneficiary is employed or not, their income, and when it comes to startups, have they founded a startup? What was the business revenue of that startup? And generally, those are the most common indicators. Most organizations we looked at, they tend to stop there. And surveys are generally conducted at 6 months. Sometimes these organizations also look at the number of hours worked per week. And sometimes surveys are conducted at the 1-year mark as well after the programming ends. But what is not being measured, most importantly? Again, we're interested in the conditions of our beneficiaries' working situations and not only whether they're employed. So we're interested in indicators like whether pay is low or sufficient to meet their daily needs, their expenses, informal versus formal employment, and labor underutilization, which simply means those who are available and willing to work more hours in the week. Whether work is excessive, that's more than 48 hours per week. And then precarious employment, usually employment under 1 year. Is it a short-term contract, fixed term, seasonal labor, situation like that? And finally, forced labor. Is the person basically being coerced against their will into working, which can be quite dangerous, obviously. And for the frequency here, again, surveys are rarely conducted beyond the 1-year mark. The organizations who bother to evaluate at 1 year rarely follow up after that. So why should these indicators be measured? And that brings us to the concept of decent work. I'm just going to touch on this because in the panel immediately following this one, actually there's a speaker from the ILO who is the expert here and can speak all about this topic. But I just wanted to highlight why it matters and why we chose it to focus on in our evaluation. So the ILO provides a pretty clear definition of what decent work is and the specific indicators. And of course, these indicators should be contextualized by country. And the ILO website has country-specific profiles for how those indicators can be used in different situations. But essentially, we care about decent work because, as the UN tells us, decent work and economic growth, they go hand in hand. So everyone wins with decent work. Some associated advantages: it's good for beneficiaries, it increases your demand for programming, and in turn, you could get more program funding. So our survey results, just for women in tech, we have about half of our women residing in Syria these days, and nearly 3/4 of them are refugee or displaced. More than half are currently employed. More than 75% work remotely, which surprised us a bit. So remote work is definitely on the rise. And almost 75% of them are either employed or in education. So making a case, a very brief case for why we should measure longer term impact is just well, these indicators are just a few examples, and we could go on. I've just included these most relevant ones that might be of interest. So by stopping at a 6-month evaluation, what do we miss? Like in our case, we would have missed 17% of those who became employed after the 6 months, after they completed the program. 47% of all of the productivity, and you have to think that includes revenue as well. The months that, and this was measured by the months that these women worked after graduation and completing the program, and 35% of those previously employed, they transitioned to formal work. And by stopping at 1 year, actually, it doesn't have much added value, but in one area, we can see some of the women did transition to formal work after 1 year. And some decent work indicator insights, just additional points of interest. Excessive working time, more than 48 hours per week, wasn't common. Only one of the currently 12 employed graduates. However, we were surprised to see that underutilized labor, half of the women who are employed are not working the number of hours that they would like to or could. And to see the full research report, we will post it to our LinkedIn next month and have a lot more findings there to share. If you're new to doing survey design, an organization like us, which is a smaller NGO, J-PAL has a great resource on guidelines for survey design and including tips on focus groups. And if your budget is limited, of course, you can do what we did and offer one cash prize at random instead of offering everyone an incentive to do the survey. So those are all of our findings for now.
Christina, thank you so much for sharing. I think this, sort of decent work and the invitation to keep, the long-term impact in the perspective, to continue to understand programs, I think is pretty aligned with what Net was saying in terms of the index. And I wonder if others, John, I'm going to pick you, talk a little bit about this idea of long-term impact and how the work that you're doing is addressing the question of do we continue to understand the programs?
Thank you very much. I think I will definitely try to respond, but I think Emma is probably better placed to speak about impact because, as I said, the evaluation that we have carried out in Jordan on the education program of Syrian refugees was using a mixed method design. So it wasn't really aspiring to capture the impact of the program. I think that is the shortcoming and the limitation of the evaluation. Then, of course, there is no method or no tool that would be perfect for absolutely everything. So there are always trade-off, I think. But I think Christina's presentation was really fascinating, and the results that she shared are really, really amazing. And they really emphasize and highlight the importance of measuring impact, and also understanding how important it is to come in with an evaluation in a time that it's actually possible to capture the impact, because impacts take time to materialize. And what, in my experience in evaluation, those who commission evaluations, they're always impatient to see the results of their work, and they commission evaluation, they want to see the results really soon. And sometimes the evaluation comes back with not that much of an effect or result, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that the intervention doesn't work. It might be that it just simply needs more time to materialize. So I think it's really important to, as Emma said, to really understand the design of the program or the intervention, and really understand the logic, how it is meant to work, and also when the results are likely to start being achieved, so that we can start measuring them at the right time. And I really loved, I think one aspect of the presentation from Christina really piqued my attention a lot. You spoke about productivity gains, and it's just such a great example, because of course if a program is effective in bringing people to work, it's great, but of course every new employee needs a little bit of time until reaching their full productivity. So the longer we wait, the more we know whether it actually, the intervention helped to just bring people to work, or it actually also allowed people to keep the work, maintain that work, to grow into their work, to progress their career. It's about the decent work, it's about the quality of work. So it's really fascinating. I mean, I'm sorry that I don't really have a very straightforward answer to your question. I think the example that I have given in the evaluation of the refugee context, that is something that we haven't really done at Trent Europe much in that space, but I would be really keen to hear how others are dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Joanna, for addressing the question and highlighting some of the points that I think Christina brought up. I think that, again, for me, like the need for long-term impact, I love the index. I love the work that Christina brought up, because it is important to measure what the program is meant to do. Is it and by working with, I think, evaluators, aligning all of these forces and funders and government agencies, really to bring the benefit to the people. I think you address a really, really important point on timing. I feel like government agencies have some timing, impact evaluations take some time. Everyone is in a hurry, but things take time, and sometimes programs that have a lot of potential get abandoned in the way because they did not produce the short-term results. So I feel like aligning all of these forces is really important. I don't know, Emma, if you have something to add.
Sure. I think maybe one thing I would just add that I think has been implicit in the discussions, but I do think is really critical and often gets lost when you're just talking to the researchers or the evaluators, is the importance of understanding. And I think Joanna was getting at this actually, is, understanding the theory of change behind the program that's actually being put forward, right? And like really talking to the people who designed that program, talking to people who are implementing it, and asking them, what does success of this program look like to you? And then we need to design, tools of evaluation that get at what they think success should look like. And I think sometimes it kind of gets flipped the other way around. So that is just all I would add.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more.
Yes.
I just wanted to say I didn't bring the concept of theory of change, because I know it's not always very well understood, and it's sometimes contested. But yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like one point, I'm going to bring 2 points. One is like, how do we share this evidence? How we unpack it for people who are really, doing other programs. And I think the other point, so sharing evidence and, sort of doing the right job so people can make the right decisions, but also how to bring, which Ned, I think you're raising your hand at the good moment. I'm saying, like, how do we bring this to the people who we want to benefit? I think the index is so important, just because we want to ask people about what they want, not just those implementing, like what is success for you, but what do you want as a family who's displaced? And Ned, please. jump in.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the okay, well, I mean, in terms of establishing what families want and what would be best for them, in order to help them kind of get where they want to go, I do think that, yeah, the SRI is useful in that way because it is kind of a free flowing and open discussion. A lot of the teams that we work with, they work within the humanitarian response infrastructure, which is pretty siloed, pretty sector focused, not a whole lot of room and not a whole lot of extra resources either to go broad outside of your direct area of focus. And so a lot of the teams that we work with, they say, you know what, until we started looking at more holistic methods of assessing households and looking at households and talking to households, we really only understood them in terms of the services that we are able to provide, which is really a narrow window on how households actually work. So, I think to get to the details on, well, what would be most useful for you? I mean, there is a question in the index, it's an open entry question that just says, yeah, what's actually most useful to you? And one thing that is always surprising to me is, a lot of the livelihoods field teams, for example, they'll say, when you ask them that question, they're just going to say startup capital for their business. That's what they're going to want. We know that that's what they want. They want more startup capital or scaling capital for their business. And then they'll say good things that are completely different from that would actually help push them in the right direction. So I think the lesson, or I think the important kind of area of focus there is that, these assessments that we do need to be open enough to make sure that we're able to get that sort of feedback and kind of relatively unstructured feedback. And I know why agencies struggle with it, because it does take more human resources and it does take more time, and it is harder to analyze than a question that you read verbatim and get responses to. But in our experience, and I think in the experience of our partners, it's very worth it. It can affect so many different parts of program development, implementation, and establishing points where you can pivot and give more impactful programming, that better achieves outcomes related to self-reliance. And then, I just wanted to respond as well to the comment from Lorraine about the program cycles. And this also relates to what Christina was saying, is that a lot of the partners that we work with on the Self-Reliance Index, they struggle with the same thing, of course. So it does take longer than they have for programs to take root, and therefore it takes longer than they have for change to be shown on the index. So, a lot of donors want an increase on Self-Reliance Index scores at a quarterly basis. This is just not how it works. And so that's one challenge. The other challenge, and Christina was alluding to this, is that the structure of the way that funds are delivered to field teams or provided to field teams does not lend itself well to assessing after the end of the implementation. And so what we really want with the Self-Reliance Index is the household to be assessed periodically, not just until services or the project ends, but a little bit after as well, because what you really want to know is, were those changes durable and sustainable, or did that family, the minute that they graduated from assistance, for example, did they fall back into a difficult situation? But because agencies have trouble kind of localizing or finding funds outside of that project cycle, once your UNHCR PPA is over, you no longer have funds to assess that household. So you have to rely on unrestricted funds or private funds or a new contract that rolls over. And there are just so many breakages in the process. So I would just say that, when we talk to donors and when we work with donors, we do kind of advocate quite a lot for reconsideration of the project cycle, funding cycles, as well as allocation for resources for follow-up assessments after the project is over, so that we can see whether these changes are durable or not, because it's hard to do in 12 months.
Thank you, Ned. I had one more question. I think I'm gonna just not ask the question, just to give the audience room for asking questions. There were a couple of questions that were asked. One was by Michael. Lorraine, do you want to ask the question, or do you want to invite the people to ask the question? What would be best?
Maybe you can ask the question, Claudia.
Yeah, so we have a question by Michael Araya. When opportunities are addressed, aiming for refugees, mostly it focuses for those who are in Syria or others, but when it comes to Africa, like those in Ethiopia, like Eritreans, uh, is it because we are they never get noticed, so that what we should do to get more window of opportunity? So I think is speaking about, you know, the focus being in Syria, but not necessarily in other refugees, displaced people. Do any of you have an answer?
I might try to attempt the answer. I think it's a very valid point. Unfortunately, the examples that I can give from the work that we have done indeed don't focus on Ethiopia or Eritrea. They did focus on the Syrian refugees. Well, of course, that's not a justification, but I think your question is broader, because generally there are evaluation of conflicts in other parts of the world, including Eritrea and Ethiopia. So there are evaluations that are carried out. It's just happened that RAND wasn't involved in those. But your question is I think broader, because it does center around, you know, including voices from the communities, from communities affected and people affected in that. And I think that is a really valid point, and this is something that we have seen in different evaluations and different contributions by people who really emphasize the importance of the focus on the refugees and migrants, because in evaluation very often you have different kind of lenses or perspectives that can be applied. It could be a lens of a hosting country, it could be a lens of origin country, but it's very important that the perspective of the refugees is really taken into account, both in the design of the evaluation, but also in discussing the findings, collecting the data, discussing the findings, and also, if possible, formulating recommendations. So that's something that I am very much keen to ensure it happens in the evaluations that we are involved. It just happens that we've done only some in this area, but not covering all the.
Yeah, I do agree with Joanna. I think that my interpretation is, you know, could we pay attention to displaced and refugees in other areas? It's not just the evaluation, but are these programs happening, and how do we understand opportunities to work with displaced populations in other regions? I know React, our MIT React program, has moved from, you know, focuses in the Middle East to being more broad and opening to other nodes in other regions. So maybe Lorraine can, or Lana, who's around, can speak a little bit about that. I want to make sure that we also address a question by Blaine regarding the RCT assessment that were mentioned by Emma and Joanna. It's saying the overall results show increase in education and decrease in labor force. Could this be due to lack of opportunities locally or policies and regulations in the region? No, Joanna and Emma, if you want to address that question.
So just to clarify, we haven't really looked at the effect of the program on the labor market. The evaluation that we carried out really focused just on this one single emergency education program. And the reasons for some of the shortcomings were not necessarily related to the labor market situation. So that I think it's not something that we could make a link to immediately. It would require follow-up.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. Emma, do you have any?
Sure. I think that, thank you for this question. I think it's very important, particularly, you know, it's something I actually come back to a lot when we're thinking about livelihood programs for refugees. And like the reality is that often some of the largest constraints are regulatory or legal ones. And so I think that, Beline, you're right to raise this. In the particular project that I was evaluating, the sort of margin, or sort of like the change, the size of the change that we were measuring, I think was within the, so, you know, if you're thinking about some of those metrics that Christina was raising, like how many hours per week are you working, or this sort of thing, not finding effects there, I don't think would be driven primarily by regulation, because people do, Syrian refugees in Jordan do have some access to employment. And we find that most of the people in our study sample are doing some, many of the, let's say like male, adult males are working. So, like, I'm not sure that those particular results are driven, or I wouldn't hypothesize they were driven by regulation, but I do think that you raise a really important point. And I think in terms of just broader program design, it's something that we can't ignore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. I think that speaks for, looking under what conditions things work or not, and not, falling short into just reporting some of the results, but the causes. It's a great question. I think we're getting close to the time. I want to ask Lorraine whether she wants to close with final comments. I would love to invite the panelists to say one thing. I feel like a couple of things that came out from the conversation where, timing and looking at long terms and sort of aligning the sort of the not only the time, but what we want to achieve, and including the voice of those we want to benefit. I don't know, Lorraine, if you're around. Oh, we have 15 more minutes.
Yeah,
Great.
I'm here. Yes. Yes.
Yes. I mean, I think there are other questions, so it's great to have more time, because I think this topic deserves a lot of time. Rezine has a question. As mentioned, the program was given to some refugees with evaluation. What are the methods or ways you see to evaluate the refugee? I'm not sure I understand.
I think this may have been about the vulnerability assessment that was done as an initial screening for the RCT. Yes, so this was, and I mean, I think that there's really no perfect method of evaluating vulnerability. Probably Ned is in a much better position to speak eloquently on this. In our position, since we were working with the Norwegian Refugee Council, we used their existing, the index that they had developed internally and were using for their programs. So we followed their lead on that.
Great.
Christina has a hand up.
Go ahead, Christina.
So just to briefly mention, I know in the presentation I focused on workforce-related outcomes. Of course, Paper Airplanes is also an educational organization, so we focus on both sets of outcomes. And to mention, one of the challenges that we face, and I think every organization in this sector faces, is just interpreting data, because we all measure so differently. And a couple of years ago, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE for short, they launched a reference group to streamline the indicators in the education sector. So if you're interested in education and emergencies data and really finding a reliable set of indicators that is on the way to be hopefully to being used worldwide, then I would suggest looking up that reference group and finding your sourcing your indicators from there.
Thank you, Christina. We have one more comment by Mikhail before I come back to the question that was pending. So important question, Lorraine. Thank you for bringing that up. Mikhail is saying, since I'm understanding peoples in the country I live can never distinguish refugees. Where you live, I'm sort of interpreting refugees are underestimated people and believe rights are banned. So what should the UN should do? Focus on responsibilities. I don't know if anyone can address this question regarding the rights of refugees. I mean, I can speak for one. I'm actually Colombian, and the country is experiencing a lot of influx of refugees coming from Venezuela, but they're not necessarily recognized as refugees. What happened in those cases? How do we address this? I think is my interpretation of the question.
Maybe I'll jump in here with because some of the I think questions in the chat also relate to kind of ethical and privacy issues, and I think these are sort of related. So happy to very briefly talk through the processes that we have internally. So the evaluations that we are conducting with vulnerable participants, they have to go through the ethical approvals, and I'm sure this is also quite similar with the RCTs in particular. But essentially, before taking on an evaluation, we would have to understand what the risks and potential harms to the participants and to the researchers are. And those risks need to be identified, and they need to be mitigated. We need to have the strategies in place to address those. And in terms of privacy issues and kind of making sure that we comply with the regulations, with the law, but also respect people's privacy. I mean, there are ethical considerations that we essentially follow, and principles. We would seek the informed consent for people to take part. We would try to explain in the very plain language what we do and give people the time and the resources also to consider whether they will want to be involved and what the implications of that would be for them, whether there will be any implications and what those implications will be. And only after such a, I'm just making it very short and really rudimentary kind of description, but only after such a really comprehensive assessment is done, the study that we would do goes through ethical committee, and it is approved by or not by the ethical committee, and only after that we would be able to start collecting the data and really contacting anyone about the evaluation. So it's a very kind of robust process to make sure that any risks, including any distress that might be caused by discussing certain topics, are really considered and taken into account and addressed.
Thank you, John. I think that's one aspect, and I'm glad Lana asked the question regarding the, sort of surveying refugees. I feel like when it comes to do no harm, it's also for me is just, I go back to the voice of those we want to benefit. Maybe it's also what Mikhail is saying. How do we address this? When we bring evidence, we want to, of course, base our work in what works and what doesn't work, bring expertise in terms of implementation. So what you described, Joanna, in terms of, making sure that the people we're working with are informed, they agree, and all of those things. But how do we bring their values and their context into consideration? I go back to what one comment Emma made before on sometimes there's delay. What do we tell people when we do a random control trial and there are 10,000 families that qualify, but only sort of a fraction of them will get the benefit? How do we address that also in with this principle in mind? I don't know if any of you want to comment on that.
I'm happy to start. And I think that the approach that I and a lot of my collaborators have often taken is to really lean on and appreciate the collaboration that we have with humanitarian partners, and recognizing, okay, we are academic researchers, but we are working with people who have many years of experience in these fields and are implementing, we're implementing these programs before we came in. And so talking to them about sort of, to the greatest extent possible, following their existing protocols or thinking of ways those protocols can be improved, of how do you, what is your current status quo of how you tell applicants whether they're going to get a program or not? Do you announce that on a rolling basis? Do you tell people that if future funds come in, they'll have access, and trying to remain honest to whatever sort of the current communication strategy is already? That said, I think that even status quos can be improved upon a lot. And personally, something I'm really taking from this conversation today is the value of, talking to the beneficiary communities to understand how we can do better on that. Already something that we've started to think about ways to build into the work I'm doing with others is just employing far more qualitative interviews. I'm a quantitative researcher, but that doesn't mean that we can't use qualitative interviews to understand how someone experienced the program beyond sort of whatever dimensions of impact we wanted to measure, and understand, you know, how could their experience be better, and then build that into future work.
Thank you, Emma. I don't know if Ned has an opinion. I feel like sometimes by asking the questions in ways that makes people realize also things that are useful to them is a good approach. So I don't know if that's how I interpret the work that Refugee Point is doing, but I think it's useful to do those things. So the question is not just for the benefit of the evaluation, but really thinking about how do we ask the questions to people to understand the things that they might be missing, the things that need to be addressed, and again, with this idea of holistic in mind.
Yeah, I would probably just really second what Christina put in the chat. I think it's all about communication, really. I think the teams that I've seen use the SRI best are those that are obviously very fluent with how the tool works and everything, but also those that have background in evaluation and how to approach someone when you're talking to them, and how to make sure that informed consent is actually informed consent. And you know, you get into actually quite dangerous territory in terms of kind of beneficiary or client expectations the broader your assessment gets. So now you're not just asking about shelter, but you're asking about everything. And so there is this risk kind of built in that clients will associate that with some line of service that's going to come in, and that may or may not be the case. And so I think really communication is key at the onset of the assessment, and making sure that field teams have a good way to present. Why is this survey being done? What is the concept of self-reliance? Why is it important for us to know about this as an agency? What will our agency do with this information? And really kind of spend a few minutes going through all that, and just not so you're just ticking a box that says we've informed them of the purpose of the survey, but that you can get a good sense that they really understand why they're doing it. And I mean, in my experience, you know, refugees, displaced people are some of the most patient, gracious people in the world. If you explain what you're trying to do and why it makes sense, I mean, people will respond positively. But, you know, the field teams in general, you know, there's a premium on their time too. They're running around here, there, everywhere. There's always too much work, but making sure that that is a fixture of the process, I think is really, really important. And the other thing that I would say has I think shown benefits to the process with the self-reliance index is having a bit of flexibility built into the system. So, you know, the questions that we ask, they don't have to be sequenced in the same way. So, for example, in the Middle East, we noticed that the question that we ask about food consumption ticks some sensitivities more than in other contexts. And so the way that you position that question and the way that you lead into that question in the assessment actually changes how it goes. So in Jordan, when we were asking about food, normally we were asking about that first, but we realized, oh, that's really kind of an intimate question. You're talking about a family's food and what they ate yesterday. So what we found was that when they moved that question to the last question of the assessment, after they've developed a rapport for about 35, 45 minutes, we got more responses where people didn't feel so they felt like they knew the person a little bit more by that point in the assessment. So building flexibility into the language that you can use to approach a topic, I think, is important, as well as kind of the position and how you actually position the topics that you progress through. I think can help with that kind of building trust and rapport throughout the process of the assessment after you ensure that you have you know, informed consent and that people know what you're trying to do. But yeah, I mean, there's a million things to say about this, but I think communication is definitely number one.
Yes, great point, both Ned and Christina. I want to end with this question by Dimitri Fidel. You know, of course, appreciating the deep work and thinking here. Is anyone willing to comment on whether funding agencies and other donors have kept pace with measuring and reporting what matters and balancing short-term results with long-term outcomes? And if not, how can we nudge them forward? I feel that that's really sort of a great question for us to end with. I feel like working together, there's complementary work, there's alignment, how we work together. But I wonder if anyone of the panelists want to take that question just to end. Yeah.
I'm happy to say just a little bit about my experience, I guess, with this. One on the positive side, I guess, one thing that I have seen, and that a lot of the donors and donor agencies that we work with is a bit more flexibility on the programming cycles, a bit more multi-year guarantees for implementations than we used to see, or than we might have seen 10 years ago. One thing that I've also seen that I would say is a positive development is decreasing donor interest in kind of cost per beneficiary calculations. I mean, when I started working, this was like the #1 consideration for every proposal we put, is how many people are we touching with this much money? So and now we've got all these approaches that are kind of on the front end pretty expensive, like graduation approach, and some of these really, I mean, 36 months program, that's a lot of money with a kind of high front end cost, but a longer low cost over time. When you talk about the fact that people by the end of the graduation approach are very oftentimes able to more or less care for themselves. So we have seen a whole lot of flexibility there. We've seen more and more donors asking for detailed assessments and detailed feedback on the impact of programming, and a willingness, I think, to put more and more lines into budget to fund that for program teams. And one of the things that we mentioned earlier that I think has not improved yet is, of course, there are still a whole lot of a big chunk of the funding available to agencies is still based on a 12-month program cycle. That's tough to contend with for agencies. You don't even start that program until like February or March anyway. So then you got 10 months left, and the last month's a wrap up anyway. So that's still, I think, problematic. And the ability for people to continue to assess clients after they've, maybe graduated them from assistance. That is still, I think, a tricky thing to figure out and to kind of work into the way that operations are budgeted.
Thank you, Ned. I want to offer Christina the opportunity to say, to comment on this. Christina, well, please go ahead.
Well, I think Ned gave an excellent answer there, and I can only add to specify, I think we're especially seeing donors wanting to change attitudes and beliefs and interested more in transformational indicators, as opposed to the traditional indicators that are measured after several months. And of course, those transformational indicators take a year, 2-3 years after the project ends to accurately measure. So that's another positive development, I think.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Christina, and thanks everyone. Thank you for the wonderful conversation and insights. I think we had a wonderful session, and I want to pass the voice to Lorraine to make sure we end on time.
Thank you very much, Claudia, everyone. That was a fantastic conversation. And I think what we can take away from this is we need to measure the long-term impact to understand how what we do is making an impact. And I think we also have to recognize that we're working with people. Christina mentioned communication. We have to actually understand that these are not just numbers, these are people we're supporting. So these individual stories are really important, the nuances, because in a way, if we can show how we've made an impact on one life, this is the story that gets the funding. I feel donors, yes, they care about the numbers, but they want to understand how the lives of people are changing. So I think this is really important for us. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm really excited to have you here. We have on the other channel in 15 minutes, we have another session on the right to work. How can we make work for refugees fair and safe? With someone from the ILO and the IOM. Please join us there. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. I know,
Thank
Lorraine,
you.
you have another tool for continuing the conversation. Is that right?
On Discord, yes. Continue discussion on Discord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Christina,
Bye.
thank you.